Committee, please come back to order. We're in the final stretch. But more applause from the audience and members. Work. Mr. Barton, you have some amendments on your side, and let's
Mr. Chairman,
bring them up.
We have two in block.
We dispose of the pending amendments? Yes.
Did we?
Did we?
Yes, it was withdrawn.
Oh, yes.
That's correct.
Right. Okay.
Mr. Radonovich is going to offer an in-block amendment, which would be Radonovich 09, Deal 005, Upton 20, Shattuck 1, Shattuck 501B, and Walden Hydro 5. I think.
Okay.
Recognize him, Mr.
Yeah, let's give the clerks a chance to find these so that we can have them distributed and have the right ones distributed.
It's Mr. Chairman.
Just wait a minute.
Radonovich 9 and
okay.
Deal 5.
Radonovich 9
and Deal 5.
And Deal 5 and what else?
That's it.
Upton 20, Shattuck 1.
Upton 20, Shattuck 1.
Shattuck 501B.
Shattuck 50. So Shattuck's got two amendments in there, 501B.
And Waldron Hydro 5.
Reserve a point of order.
The gentlelady reserves a point of order.
And make sure that Booyer knows that he's off and all of that.
On the first one, yes. Okay.
On this one. Okay. We're doing this one now. Radonovich. Yeah, Radonovich.
Okay, you started with the second. Okay, that's fine. That's fine. You're in the next one. It's all right.
Okay.
We just divided into two, so. Okay, Shattuck. Okay.
Where are we at?
I'm just doing what you told me.
I know. You are. Unfortunately, I didn't open up.
We didn't make enough copies?
Yeah.
Well, while they get them,
We just have to wait,
Oh, you didn't make copies.
give them time to find these amendments since they're.
Clerk will report the amendment.
An amendment offered by Mr. Radonovich at the end of Title III. Insert the following new.
Amendment will be considered as read. Chair will withdraw her reservation and recognize Mr. Radonovich for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. My amendment is the Agriculture Jobs Off-Ramp Amendment, and I happen to represent the Great Central Valley in California. We produce and grow some of the best fruits and vegetables, not just for California, but for the entire country, and it's got a large export component of it as well. And right now we're suffering mightily, not because of the global warming bill, but because the Endangered Species Act, which protects a worthless little worm that is going extinct, and it's shut down the pumps, and it's costing the people of the Central Valley 40,000 jobs this year and a loss of $2 billion of income in the state's largest industry. Now, as I'd mentioned, this is not due to global warming. It's due to the abuses of a well-intentioned law that was written in 1974, the Endangered Species Act, that's run amok and creating an enormous amount of job losses. My concern is that this type of environmental alarmism is going to be the result of this global warming bill and its adverse impacts on the price of agricultural input costs, not just in California, but all across the country. My fear is that this bill will increase the price of gas or diesel, natural gas, electricity, fertilizer, cars, trucks, tractors, and trailers, transportation in the form of rail, truck, and plane, machine parts, and traditional agriculture tools. This bill, I believe, will disproportionately punish low and middle class families in my district, many of whom are traditionally agriculture workers. And if these agriculture jobs are lost, we will mostly be more dependent on foreign sources for our food supply. If you like buying oil from Hugo Chavez, you're going to love buying your breakfast, lunch, and dinner from him as well, because these types of increased costs on California agriculture and American agriculture will force these industries offshore and in different countries. And that's why I'm dropping this legislation, this amendment that would require the Secretary of Labor to report back on the number of agriculture jobs lost nationally. And if it reaches 5%, the provisions of this act will cease to be effective. I want to thank you for the consideration of this bill and yield to the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Shadig.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I appreciate his proportion of this en bloc amendment. I have two pieces in it. One deals with the issue of essentially the foreign aid provision in this legislation. This legislation calls for spending money by giving it to other countries to purchase clean technology from the United States. Unfortunately, it talks about the expenditure of billions of dollars, minimum of $6.374 billion in the time period from 2012 to 2021, another $7.977 billion from 2022 to 2026, another $81 billion in the period 2027 to 2050, for a total minimum of over $95 billion, which we give away to foreign countries to buy clean technology. As worthy as that goal may be, there are many here in this country who think that money would be better spent in the United States. My amendment simply says it should go instead to low-income consumers here in the United States. The second amendment, which I have, recognizes the legitimate stake that states have in this issue, and that is we have concern on our side of the aisle about employment. We've offered many different avenues to try to address increasing unemployment in this legislation, or as a result of this legislation. All of those amendments have been rejected. This is yet another attempt. This is an attempt that would say that if, as a result of this legislation, unemployment goes up in a given state by more than 2%, then that state may opt out of Title III by one of three things: a declaration by its governor, a piece of legislation by its legislature opting out, or a vote of its people. This is a recognition that it is the people who will be impacted. They have local officials who represent them, and that some portions of the country are being adversely affected at the moment, much worse than others. For example, my friends from Michigan, which face the highest unemployment in the nation. And I would strongly urge the adoption of these two amendments and yield back my time to Mr. Radonovich.
Will the gentleman yield, Mr.
I'd be happy to yield.
I just want to say I was glad to have my amendment included as part of this as well. As Mr. Shattuck said, There is no bigger issue in the Midwest, let alone Michigan, than the jobs issue. And yesterday, our unemployment numbers came out, and they're almost 13%. And we're well on the way to the dire prediction of perhaps 20% by the end of the summer. And what my amendment does is this. I know that we saved Mr. Wilder's job, who did a terrific job as one of the reading clerks there for a minute or two, going through 40 or 50 pages, as I understand it. But as we look at this bill itself, we're going to see a lot of jobs go someplace else, a lot more than just Mr. Wilder's. And what my amendment says is that if there's a greater than a 10% unemployment rate across the country, that we would cease the transfer of money to foreign entities and instead divert it to worker training for people who lost their jobs in this country. It's a good amendment. It's part of this one, the en bloc, and I'd like to think that it would be considered. I yield back to the gentleman from California.
Gentleman's time's expired.
I thank the gentleman and yield back the time I don't have.
For a gentleman from Massachusetts.
I thank the gentlelady very much. We've had this discussion over and over again, and it has manifested itself in different ways, but it all comes down to the same decision which we have to make. And that is whether or not we believe that the legislation which we are considering is going to create a new generation of green jobs. Whether or not it's going to lead to developing the domestic capacity for us to begin to back out that 13 million barrels of oil a day, which we consume from overseas. That's the choice. This particular iteration, this particular formulation, is one that gives to the EPA administrator the ability to make a determination regarding job losses. In this case, the cessation of the operation of the legislation is tied to job losses in the agriculture industry. We fundamentally reject, on our side of the aisle, this level of pessimism with regard to the opportunities which this legislation is going to present, especially in the agricultural sector, especially in the offsets sections of the legislation, especially with regard to the solar and to the wind, which is going to be possible out in the rural parts of this country. We fundamentally reject it. And to tie the long-term implementation of this legislation to a determination by the administrator of the EPA would be to fundamentally destroy the confidence which the investors, not only of our country, but the world would have in this program. We are trying to create some confidence, some long-term predictability that will lead us to a new generations of jobs, not just in urban America, but here empowering rural America. They have a huge role in the effort that this legislation is going to unleash. And so we've already cast this vote at least a half a dozen times. There have been a different number of approaches which have been taken to derail this bill, to create off-ramps which end the ability for this legislation to be implemented. But at the end of the day, the vote must be no. There's a new dawn of energy job creation, which this bill will signal by the end of this evening. And I urge the members not to allow a decision made by an EPA administrator to end it, because that will be the top line of every memo written in every investment banking firm in the world about whether or not they should be investing in the new technologies that we are trying to unleash.
Would the gentleman yield for a question?
I mean, let me yield first to the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Sarbanes.
Thank you for yielding. Very quickly, there's been a lot of discussion of these off-ramps. And conceptually, what I've arrived at is that we're on this highway, and every proposal that the other side has put forward is designed to take an off-ramp from the future. We're never going to get to where we need to get if we keep putting our blinker on and taking the next off-ramp. And meanwhile, as we're getting off the highway, these other countries are continuing on and passing us by. And that's the danger here. So whether it's a small off-ramp or the giant off-ramp in the form of the substitute that was offered a little while ago, we can't afford to stop this forward progress, and I would urge people to reject this proposal.
Will the gentleman yield?
I will reclaim my time. The Shattuck and the Upton amendments also shift the emission allowances away from the International Clean Technology Deployment Program, and there too we're trying to create partnerships so that we can have a global approach to these issues. I don't think that this approach makes any sense whatsoever, but I'll be glad to yield to whoever it is that is seeking recognition. The gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Upton.
Just a quick comment. My amendment is not an off-ramp. It is a diversion of the money back to worker training, but I just like to know if the gentleman knows how much money is in this bill for the international fund and how much money is in there for worker training for those that are displaced because of the act. And like Mr. Shimkus, I know the answer, I think, and I'll let the...
For the international programs?
How many, I'll put it this way, do you know how many times greater the international fund is over the displaced worker fund? 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5?
No, the international worker, the workers program is essentially 1% of the allocation, and the international program, I think, is approximately 1% of the, including adaptation to the program.
Gentleman's time's expired. The vote now occurs.
Madam Chairwoman, I would seek recognition and support also. We agreed to
Does the gentleman ask unanimous consent to be recognized for 2 minutes?
If I need unanimous consent, I didn't know I needed it. Well, we agreed to 10 minutes on each side.
Oh, okay, the gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. One of the amendments in this in-block amendment is an amendment by Congressman Deal of Georgia, who is not here, and I think it is worthy of some explanation. He would set up a public information program where the Secretary of Labor would make a quarterly calculation of the number of adversely affected workers receiving payments under Section 425, which is the Climate Change Worker Assistance Program. Now, in spite of the protestations of many of the supporters of this legislation that there's not going to be any negative economic impact, there are close to 100 pages in the legislation going through the Climate Change Worker Adjustment Assistance Program, and workers who are eligible for such assistance include workers employed in the energy producing and transforming industry, industries dependent upon energy industries, energy-intensive manufacturing industries, consumer goods manufacturing, and other industries whose employment the Secretary determines has been adversely affected by any requirement of Title VII of the Clean Air Act. So apparently somebody believes that in spite of what we've heard for the last 4 days, there are going to be some negative economic impacts. And in this bill, in addition to the normal unemployment benefits that we have already, this creates an additional program, as I understand it, on top of. And so the Deal Amendment would simply say that you have to make a quarterly calculation of those adversely affected workers and put it up on a website that would be maintained by the Department of Energy. It's an informational amendment. So it is part of the in-block, and I thought that deserved to have some time. And I think I would yield to Mr. Walden.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to speak toward the Walden amendment on hydropower. And first of all, this is water. You pour it in here, and it's the same water you pour in here. No. And under this bill, this water going through one dam produces electricity that has no carbon footprint, but it's not renewable. If you go through a different one, it is, depending upon the year. And I'd like to know from the chairman why January 1 of 1992 was picked as the year before which this water that goes through this dam isn't renewable, and if it goes through after it, it is. Who made the decision on 1992?
We'll defer to Mr. Markey.
Mr. Markey, can you inform me?
In the same way that 2005 is used as a benchmark, or 2020 is used as a benchmark, that number was chosen after considerable deliberation, reflecting upon a large set of construction projects that actually had reached their culmination point during that time period. And it was felt that it would make sense to include them because it would help actually then in making a...
I'm going to reclaim my time and go to the next piece of this amendment because I'm using up time here, but I'd love to get the list of those projects. Clause 3, however, on page 15, says that the hydro project installed in the dam is operated so that the water surface elevation at any given location and time that would have occurred in the absence of the hydroelectric project is maintained. In other words, if you put an electrical generation device on a dam, the energy produced for that device is not considered as new hydro and renewable if at any location or time the water behind that dam is affected by the addition of that electrical generating device, that turbine. I have talked to engineers from the Corps of Engineers who tell me it is physically impossible not to do that. And so therefore, while we've heard a lot of talk on that side about how we're going to encourage new hydro, the practical and engineering effect of Clause 3 precludes that new hydro from ever being considered. And so our amendment fixes both of these issues, and I urge its support.
Does any member wish to be recognized in opposition to the en bloc amendment?
Yes, Madam Chairman.
Gentleman from California.
Thank you. I just want to respond to some comments by my colleague from California, and I certainly appreciate the concern about farm jobs. I have a lot of agriculture in my district, and we're seeing huge decreases in the withdrawals for the Delta. But the Delta smelt, which was referred to as the worthless worm, is the base of the Delta food chain, and it is going extinct. But it's only resulted in about 300,000 acre-feet reduction. That's only 5% of the withdrawal from the Delta. Now, the real cause of the low, extremely low, damagingly low withdrawals is 3 consecutive years of very low rainfall, and that is consistent with global warming. I don't know if it can be blamed on or not, but certainly consistent, and 50 years of overdrafting the Delta. So I'm very concerned about blaming this bill, and we'll see that as we move forward, for all the problems we're having in California and and other environmental laws for damaging the state. I think the environmental laws are making our state healthier and making our country healthier. For example, the Clean Water Act. Where would we be now without the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the amendments to the Clean Air Act in 1990? No, so the arguments that were given forth on that, I don't think carry water. And so I urge my colleagues to vote against that.
Will the gentleman yield?
Yes, I yield.
Does the gentleman support the closure of the pumps in the Delta due to the Delta smelt decision, the Wanger decision?
The Delta withdrawal is due to very low water.
Does the gentleman support the decision, the Wanger decision, to shut the pumps down for the Delta smelt?
That decision was made in the judicial area, so
can the gentleman from California answer yes or no on that?
No, the gentleman is not going to answer yes or no on that.
Would the gentleman from
California controls the time.
Would the gentleman from California yield?
Yes, I yield back to the gentleman from Massachusetts.
I thank the gentleman very much, and that just so that all members can know that the language in the bill has been endorsed by the National Hydropower Association. So I think
were they part, Mr. Chairman, will you yield? Were they part of?
Gentleman from California.
The gentleman from California has time. I just thought everyone should know that We think the language in the bill.
Would the gentleman from California yield for a question to the chairman of the committee, since he raised the Hydropower Association? I just have a question. Did they give the list?
The gentleman has not. Does the gentleman yield?
Okay, so thank you for yielding. Because my question is, so the Hydropower Association, so they support Clause 3 on page 15? And did they provide the list of the facilities and come up with the date?
The National Hydropower Association, in conjunction with American Rivers Association, drafted the language that is actually used for the production tax credit as well. So we tried to work with groups that are out there, and we believe that we reached a good formula, and we look forward to working with the gentleman in the weeks ahead.
And would you be willing to provide me that list of the dams or electric facilities since 92 that took you back to that 92 date? Because your discussion draft from the week before had a different date, and that's why.
We will provide the information to them.
I appreciate that. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
The gentleman from California yield back. Gentleman yields back. The vote now occurs on the en bloc amendment. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no?
No.
The opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Madam Chairman, we would ask for a roll call vote.
Recorded vote has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Waxman. Mr. Waxman votes no. Mr. Dingle. Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey votes no. Mr. Boucher. Mr. Boucher, no. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Gordon. Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush votes no. Ms. Eshoo. Ms. Eshoo votes no. Mr. Stupak. Mr. Stupak, no. Mr. Engel. Mr. Green. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette, no. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps votes no. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle, no. Ms. Harmon. Ms. Harmon votes no. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky, no. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez votes no. Mr. Inslee. Mr. Inslee, no. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin votes no. Mr. Ross. Mr. Weiner. Mr. Weiner, no. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson, no. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield, no. Mr. Melanson. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow votes no. Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill, no. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui votes no. Mrs. Christensen. Mrs. Christensen, no. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor, no. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes votes no. Mr. Murphy of Connecticut. Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Space. Mr. Space votes no. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney, no. Ms. Sutton. Ms. Sutton, no. Mr. Braley. Mr. Braley votes no. Mr. Welch. Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton votes aye. Mr. Hall. Mr. Hall votes aye. Mr. Upton. Mr. Upton, aye. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Stearns, aye. Mr. Deal. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield, aye. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus, aye. Mr. Shattuck? Mr. Shattuck, aye. Mr. Blunt? Mr. Blunt votes aye. Mr. Boyer? Mr. Boyer, aye. Mr. Radonovich? Mr. Radonovich votes aye. Mr. Pitts? Mr. Pitts, aye. Ms. Bono Mack? Ms. Bono Mack, aye. Mr. Walden? Mr. Walden, aye. Mr. Terry? Mr. Terry, aye. Mr. Rogers? Mr. Rogers, aye. Mrs. Myrick? Mrs. Myrick votes aye. Mr. Sullivan? Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania? Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess votes aye. Ms. Blackburn? Ms. Blackburn, aye. Mr. Gingrey? Mr. Gingrey votes aye. Mr. Scalise? Mr. Scalise votes aye. Mr. Dingle? Mr. Dingle votes no. Mr. Pallone? Mr. Pallone votes no. Mr. Gordon? Mr. Gordon votes no. Mr. Green? Mr. Green, no. Mr. Engel? Mr. Engel votes no. Yeah. Oh, Mr. Ross? Mr. Ross, no. Mr. Melanson? Is he here? He's not here? Where is he? What? I'm sorry, I can't see him. He votes no? Ms. Melanson votes no. I got him. Mr. Welch. Oh, Mr. Welch. I'm sorry. Mr. Welch votes no. Anybody on this side? Mr. Deal. Okay. That's what I have.
Have all members responded to the call of the roll? The clerk will tally the vote and announce the outcome.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 22 ayes and 36 noes.
22 ayes, 36 noes. The amendment is not agreed to. Gentlelady from Ohio, Ms. Sutton, has an amendment at the desk. Without objection, it will be considered as read. Just to, well, wait a minute to have it distributed.
Buried under this.
The gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes on her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and hopefully this won't take near that long. This amendment addresses an issue. Currently, the Davis-Bacon provisions in this bill apply to carbon capture and storage projects funded through the Carbon Capture and Storage Research Corporation, which is Section 115, and CCS deployment projects for the use of CCS bonus allowances, Section 114. And I, of course, strongly support these provisions, and I'm offering an amendment to apply Davis-Bacon throughout the bill. The amendment is designed to ensure that prevailing wage rates are paid to construction workers on all federally assisted construction activities related to this act. This amendment is essential to ensuring that the green jobs created by this bill are also good family-sustaining jobs. For example, under this bill, allowances are allocated to encourage the construction of clean energy resources, and other allowances are allocated for domestic adaptation activities. And in order to maintain the consistent application of Davis-Bacon to federally assisted construction, the community wage standards of the Act should apply to those provisions of the bill. This amendment also includes an exemption under the Retrofit for Energy and Environmental Performance Program for the residential bid program, and this exemption recognizes that individuals will be utilizing this program for upgrades to their home. And in addition, there's an exemption for small businesses. Those would be projects less than 6,500 square feet, which is premised on a case codified in 1971 for post offices. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield.
Would the gentlelady yield to me?
I will yield to the chairman.
The Davis-Bacon Act requires that workers on federally funded construction projects be paid no less than the wages paid in the community for similar work. This law prevents the federal government, which is a large, influential construction owner, from using tax dollars to undercut local wage standards through its investments in construction work. It's important that we build a clean energy economy with good high-wage jobs and quality workers, and I strongly support this amendment. Gentlelady yields back her time.
I do.
Mr. Barton.
Very briefly, Mr. Chairman, I rise in opposition. I guess if we're going to pass a bill that where cost is no object and what the price of anything is that's under this act, we might as well add an amendment to it that says you have to have some sort of a minimum wage rate. I'm not opposed to workers having high wages, obviously, and I'm certainly not opposed on direct federal contracts where the construction is a federal project having a Davis-Bacon component. But this amendment, if adopted, would say that any entity that receives emission allowances or funding under the Act would have to comply with make a reasonable effort to comply with Davis-Bacon. It does implicitly acknowledge that that might be counterproductive because it does have an exemption for residential buildings and non-residential commercial space. It's, if I read it right, less than 6,500 square feet. So it implicitly acknowledged that there's the possibility that the wage rates paid might be above the market. So we thought there might be a germaneness question on this, Mr. Chairman, because it is Davis-Bacon. But since you're not changing the Davis-Bacon Act, you're just saying that it has to apply to this Act, our parliamentarian has said that there is not a germaneness test. So we oppose it on policy grounds, would hope that it is not made a part of the Act.
Gentleman has the time.
And I'll yield to Mr. Stearns.
I thank the chair, the ranking member. I would like to ask counsel, if a family inherits a home from their father and mother, and it's a large home, and it's in Florida, Central Florida, and it turns out it's 6,505 square feet. It's a residential building. Would they have to have Davis-Bacon apply to them if they retrofitted this house based upon this act?
My understanding of the amendment is that the residential definition in the retrofit program is completely exempted, and that would include any single-family home.
It says here, if the net interior space of such non-residential building is less than 6,500 feet. So this is above that threshold, 6,505 feet.
I thought you defined it as a family home. That's a residential building.
Non-residential. Okay, so all residentials are exempt.
That's right.
Okay, so if they had a small business in a building that was 6,505 feet, then what would happen?
Then it would be defined as a non-residential property, and if they retrofitted the home pursuant to the provisions of that act, and this amendment was part of the act,
Okay.
the Davis-Bacon standards
And
would apply.
so they live in Florida, and so that would apply. And they couldn't do anything with a private contractor on this commercial building?
Well, they could choose any contractor they wanted as long as the wage standards under the Davis-Bacon Act were complied
Well, they put out a they put out a price for to fix this building. It turns out they get a lower price, and they don't even know about the Davis-Bacon Act, and they accept the lower price. What happens to them then?
You're talking about, gentlemen, yield, you're talking about a violation of the Davis-Bacon Act?
Well, I'm saying in this case, they get 3 estimates. Maybe one of them is lower, and they take it, and they don't know it's against the Davis-Bacon Act. So I guess what happens to them then? Is there inspectors out here to confirm this in Central Florida, that they have their commercial building actually retrofitted?
If they were applying for federal money through the REAP program that came to the states, and the Davis-Bacon Act would apply to their building, as a condition of obtaining that grant to pay up to half the cost of the retrofit, the Davis-Bacon conditions would apply. And if they were to use that money, they would have to meet the conditions of this provision, and presumably would be guided by the state as to how to obtain the appropriate assurances that their payment for their half of that and for
Okay, I'll just conclude, Mr. Chairman. What is the fine or penalty if they don't do this?
I do not know the penalty.
Does the chairman know what would happen to this family if they retrofitted their home?
Don't know. Don't know the answer, but I do know the time's up.
Okay.
We now go to the vote. All those in favor of the Sutton Amendment say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the amendment's agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, could we have a roll call vote on that, please?
You do want a roll call vote?
Please.
Okay. Clerk will call the roll. Yeah, that's it. We are getting near the end. I'm just talking to myself. We are getting near the end.
Mr. Waxman.
Mr. Waxman votes aye.
Mr. Waxman, aye. Mr. Dingle. Mr. Dingle votes aye. Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey, aye. Mr. Boucher. Mr. Boucher, aye. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes aye. Mr. Gordon. Mr. Gordon, aye. Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush, aye. Ms. Eshoo. Ms. Eshoo votes aye. Mr. Stupak. Mr. Stupak, aye. Mr. Engel. Mr. Green. Mr. Green. Mr. Green votes aye. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette, aye. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps, aye. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle, aye. Ms. Harmon. Ms. Harmon, aye. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky votes aye. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez votes aye. Mr. Inslee. Mr. Inslee, aye. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross, aye. Mr. Weiner. Mr. Weiner votes aye. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson, aye. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield, aye. Mr. Melanson. Mr. Melanson, aye. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow votes aye. Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill votes aye. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui votes aye. Mrs. Christensen. Mrs. Christensen votes aye. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor, aye. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes, aye. Mr. Murphy of Connecticut. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Space. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney, aye. Ms. Sutton. Ms. Sutton, aye. Mr. Braley. Mr. Braley votes aye. Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch, aye. Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton votes no. Mr. Hall. Mr. Hall, no. Mr. Upton. Mr. Upton votes aye. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Stearns votes no. Mr. Deal. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield, no. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus, aye. Mr. Shadegg. Mr. Shadegg votes no. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Blunt, no. Mr. Boyer. Mr. Boyer votes no. Mr. Radonovich. Mr. Radonovich votes no. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts votes no. Ms. Bono-Mack. Ms. Bono-Mack votes no. Mr. Walden. Mr. Terry. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers, no. Mrs. Myrick. Mrs. Myrick, no. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan votes no. Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania. Mr. Murphy votes aye. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess, no. Ms. Blackburn. Ms. Blackburn, no. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Gingrey, no. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise votes no. Let's see who we miss here. Oh. Mr. Terry? Not recorded, I think. Hold on. Hold on. No, not recorded. Votes no? I'm sorry. Did you vote no? Okay. Huh? Okay. Mr. Terry votes no.
There are some members still waiting to be called.
Okay. Mr. Engel. Mr. Engel votes aye. Mr. Space. Mr. Space, aye. Yeah. Ready.
All members respond to the roll. The clerk has tallied the roll, and we'd like to have the outcome.
On that amendment, Mr. Chairman, there were 39 yeas and 18 noes.
39 yes, 18 noes. The amendment's agreed to. Mr. Inslee, and then we'll go to you. Mr. Inslee, are you ready?
I am, Mr. Chair. I have an amendment to offer.
Gentleman has an amendment at the desk. Do you wish to offer it as an amendment?
I do. I will be offering him in bonk. It's Inslee unnumbered and Inslee 49. I'd wish to offer him in bonk. I'll be then separating the question and withdrawing one of them.
Without objection, the
Mr. Chairman, point of order.
Gentleman state his point of order.
Aren't we rotating? And like you folks just had one. Wouldn't we come to this side first before you go to your side again, just at normal, regular order?
The gentleman shouldn't be concerned about it.
Oh, I'm not.
You have one amendment left on your side. We have a couple on our side.
I'm not real concerned.
Don't worry about it.
That means we should get an amendment actually passed if we, you know, it's one thing to offer, Mr. Chairman, it's another thing to have them accept.
Would the chairman yield?
Who's asking me to yield to whom?
Boyer? If we're going
Mr. Boyer, you're going to be offering the next amendment.
We are. We're going to do ours en bloc. So why don't you take your remain amendments, do them en bloc, and maybe we can finish up the bill. Just a suggestion.
Thanks for the suggestion. So it's one we ought to. No, it's a helpful one. But we have different members on different issues, and
I know. I just
they have different deals made.
They have rights. People have rights as individual members, and some are willing to put them together, and some not. And in this case, for example, by unanimous consent, I'd like to ask that Mr. Inslee be able to offer his two amendments in block, one of which he's going to withdraw, as I understand it, but he hasn't asked to withdraw it yet. So I'd like to recognize him, but let's be sure we have unanimous consent that the two amendments be considered as read. And Mr. Inslee, you have two amendments, but you only get 1 5-minute period of time, and you're now recognized for that.
Thank you. I will be as brief as duty permits. The first amendment, the one we hope to pass, and we may or may not have a vote on, but we will pass, is Inslee 49. Basically, this amendment will create a loan guarantee program for the adoption and perfection of high-capacity transmission technologies. We know that we have to substantially increase the capacity of our transmission system to deal both with increasing demands and the fact that renewable energy now requires a whole new dynamic of our transmission system. We know that whereas we used to be able to bring coal to the generating plant, we can't bring wind to the generating plant, or solar cell, we can't ship photons or wind to a central generating plant. We have to generate the electricity where they are located and then transmit them to the site where we need the electricity. So we know we need substantial changes in our transmission system. This is a proposal that Mr. Hoyer originally proposed in legislation that would essentially make high-capacity transmission technologies eligible for stimulus funding and create a loan guarantee program to help with their adoption. We haven't had enough props in our hearing, so I can hold one up. This is a wire by American Semiconductor, and they have a system where by using super-cooled metals, they can create the same capacity at like 150th the amount of volume of metal and less than 1/5 of the width of a corridor. And we now have at least 3 places in the United States lines that are actually, number one, underground, don't have visual problems that bother our constituents, have a 50-foot corridor rather than a 300-foot corridor, and have efficiencies in the area of 20 to 30% more efficient. So we want to move these technologies forward. We need to, the amendment simply would make this eligible for stimulus funding and create a small $100 million grant program for the perfection of these technologies. It's one of the things we have to do. I'll be offering that amendment. The second amendment I will be withdrawing attempts to find a solution to our siting challenges we have with our transmission system. We know how difficult it is to site transmission lines. All of us who are in public life understand that our constituents, Republicans and Democrats, share all two traits. We all want unlimited electricity, and we want zero electric lines anywhere in our states and country. Reconciling those two things is difficult. The amendment I will offer and withdraw would propose a way to solve that problem or move forward by creating backstop siting authority for the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. It would suggest that if a state is unsuccessful in siting a line after 3 years, that the FERC would have jurisdiction then and only then to site the line. The proposal we would make would suggest that that should be for lines that help fulfill utilities' obligation to provide renewable energy. It would also give great deference to states by requiring the recommendations of states to be followed as to siting even after the 3-year period, unless the FERC could find a reason that would make that a non-viable proposal. It would not expand the eminent domain authority, but would be essentially the same as if states provided the siting of these lines. Now, the reason I have proposed this is it's just very clear that we have some responsibility that requires some heavy lifting. And that heavy lifting is to find a way to respond to the national challenge for a national grid. When we built our grid, it responded to local challenges and local generation capability. We now need a national system that will respond to the national challenge of dealing with global warming and really using the renewable energy sources that we have. So there may be many proposals to accomplish that. This is one. We have not been able to find consensus as of this moment on this subject, but I look forward to working with Mr. Markey, Mr. Waxman, to hopefully find a solution by the time we go to the floor. I want to thank Mr. Markey particularly
Before you thank
for
Mr.
his
Markey,
efforts.
would you yield to me?
And I will yield to Mr. Waxman.
Let me express my strong feeling of that we must have a transmission provision in this legislation, especially for the West. And the West needs the interconnect and the ability to develop that transmission. So Mr. Markey, as chairman of the subcommittee, is going to hold hearings on it, and by the time we get to the House floor, I expect we're going to develop an amendment that we will put into the legislation. We can't ignore the needs for the western part of this country, while at the same time, of course, we need to understand the concerns of the people on the East Coast. But many of us live on the West Coast, and we want this transmission issue resolved. You might want to yield to Mr. Markey. The gentleman, without objection, gentleman is given an additional minute.
Yield, Mr. Markey.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I thank the gentleman very much for all of his work on this legislation. There are many different stakeholders involved in this issue. And as the chairman said, we think it's advisable for us to have a full-blown hearing on this issue with all of the stakeholders in the country who are able to participate. But as the chairman said, towards the goal of developing a transmission piece for this legislation. And without question, the gentleman from Washington State has been the driving force on this issue. And we intend to work with him as the leader towards developing that final product that we can use in the legislation. And I thank the gentleman for all of his work.
I appreciate that. I look forward to working with you. Just one final comment. You know, this bill is going to require, in this challenge, some really heavy lifting by all of us, whether you're from a coal-fired state or a steel state or a hydro state. All of us are going to have heavy lifting here. That's certainly true on transmission, and I hope we can find a solution so we all share in that. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
The gentleman from Washington has withdrawn one of his amendments dealing with the transmission interconnect, and his other amendment is still pending. Mr. Barton?
I seek recognition to strike the requisite number of words.
Gentleman's recognized.
First of all, I want to say that the amendment that he's not withdrawn, the minority is prepared to accept. On the amendment that he did withdraw, I would like to point out that the Republican alternative had a transmission siting component to it. There were some differences. The gentleman's amendment that he's withdrawing is good as far as it goes, but in the eastern interconnection, it only applies to states that are in that eastern interconnection. And the amendment that I saw earlier was for underground corridors, but this one apparently is above ground also. But it only applies to projects that are for the renewable energy component. We're going to need transmission siting for all types of transmission, not just for renewable energy projects. So we stand prepared. Mr. Terry has worked on this amendment. We had something similar to this in the Energy Policy Act of 2005 for what we called high-intensity corridors between the states that there was, I believe, a court challenge to. So the gentleman from Washington and gentleman from Nebraska have certainly identified an area that regardless of what happens to this particular bill, they have identified a problem that we need to address because our transmission grid is out of date. It is subject to blackouts. It is also subject to potential terrorist attacks. It was designed for a regulated market, which more and more we're beginning to have a deregulated power market at the wholesale level. So we stand prepared to work with Mr. Inslee, Mr. Waxman, Mr. Markey, and others to try to solve this problem.
Gentleman, yield to me.
Be happy to use.
I thank you very much for those words, and that to me is very encouraging. We need to work together on these issues. This is an important issue on transmission, and as Mr. Inslee said, it may be heavy lifting. This whole bill is heavy lifting. The whole problems of energy and the demand for jobs and independence and economic growth is hard to do.
It's his time.
We need to do it together. We may not be together today on the legislation that is going to pass out of committee, but let me extend an invitation to all the members, Democrat and Republican. Let's sit down and work together as we go forward, because we, I think, should try to reach a point where we can support something on a bipartisan basis that the committee will put forward on the House floor. So I thank you for your comments.
Mr. Barton, would you yield just for a moment, Mr. Barton?
Happy to yield.
I want to thank you also for not correcting me when I referred to these as semiconductors. They are superconducting lines, and I want to appreciate you not humiliating me in the eyes of the United States of America. I take care of that myself. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It would be impossible for me to humiliate you. But seriously, you have done an excellent job on this bill, and you're to be commended, not just on this section, but on all the sections. You have been an indefatigable proponent of this, and you should have a tremendous celebration this evening for the efforts you've made on behalf of this bill.
The vote now comes after, well, would you yield to Ms. Eshoo?
Sure.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, and thank you to the ranking member for yielding his time. Even though this discussion comes very late in our markup, it is nonetheless, as has been noted by the speakers so far, how important it is. I'm very pleased to co-sponsor this effort at the committee. I mean, current transmission lines are copper. Advanced composite is 30% more efficient. Superconducting is 60% more efficient. And members should recall with some pleasure those that voted for the ARPA funds that there are going to be monies available for this. And so from those that are going to apply, the facilities and utilities, we're going to win in terms of having a much better grid in the country. So this is really important. It bumps up the effort to a whole new level for our country. And so I'm pleased to be part of the effort and glad that the ranking member supports it. I think it'll be good news for the country, and I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. The vote, the vote now comes on the Inslee amendment. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the amendment's agreed to. The chair would like to now call on Mr. Boyer to offer an amendment. Do you have just one amendment, or other?
I have one en bloc amendment, which will be the last amendment on the Republican side, given that you have no more amendments?
Well, we do have some amendments on the Democratic side, but
how many amendments do you have on your side? Because we got like 400 more if you want us to go.
You've been very generous in taking up our time in this markup, but I don't want to be criticized for not calling on a Republican offer an amendment at this point. If you prefer, we can have some more Democrats.
How many amendments does your side have? Because what we're trying to do is trying to be helpful here, Mr. Chairman. We're taking 8 amendments and making them en bloc to be cooperative here.
We have 2 amendments on our side that will be offered and voted on, and there'll be several. I don't know how many will be offered and withdrawn. Does that make you want to go now with yours, or do you want to wait?
No, I think we'll show your hand. Have you brought up Title IV to the bill?
Oh, the bill's been open for amendment at any point for a very long time.
All right. Well, I will reserve the right to offer this amendment and allow you to go next.
All right. Mr. Space? Oh, just a minute. I did promise Mr. Matheson. Oh. You don't care? Then Mr. Space. Mr. Space, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read, and the gentleman from Ohio is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a relatively simple but important amendment, particularly for agricultural producers who are affected by the bill. The bill itself provides offset credits for certain agricultural activities. Section 732 is the section that provides for those credits. Section 733 defines those credits somewhat vaguely. We did attempt to resolve that by way of an amendment earlier today, but at the chair's suggestion that we would work on those issues, that amendment was withdrawn. Notwithstanding that offset activity credit remains in the bill, Section 734 currently imposes a requirement that with limited exceptions, these activities which are subject to offset credits are eligible for those credits only if they started after January 1st, 2009. The theory being that we want to reward people who begin these new activities and capturing carbon. The problem is that by limiting these offsets only to those projects began after January 1st, 2009, we're prejudicing those who have engaged in those activities in advance, who are essentially at the head of the curve when it comes to climate change conduct. One example that comes to mind is no-till plowing or no-till practices in the agricultural community. If you have 2 farmers, one who has been engaging in responsible practices for the last 5 years, no-till plowing, for example, on one side of the road, and on the other side of the street, a farmer that has never engaged in it but begins to engage in the activity after January 1st, 2009, the more irresponsible farmer will get the offset credit. The responsible farmer will not. And although this may sound a bit mundane to most of the members of this committee, it's actually very important to those farmers who want to participate in this bill. So it's not only unfair to those farmers who have been proactive, it's also encouraging farmers that have been engaging in the no-till practices. It will encourage them to cease that activity for a defined period of time and then reinitiate, and that circumvents the very intent and purposes of the bill. So what this amendment essentially provides, and it is the material part of the amendment is in subsection B2, that will provide that the activity that the individual seeks an offset for must have begun after January 1st of 2009, except with regard to activities that are easily and readily reversible, and where the administrator determines that to change the date would remove the incentive to cease and then reinitiate. It's a rather complicated and complex analogy, but it's one that applies especially to those relatively small family farms. This should be a somewhat non-controversial amendment, and we're asking that the body of this committee approve this amendment.
Gentlemen, yield to me. I think this amendment is a good one, and I urge members to support it. You are allowing the offsets for projects that have been done in anticipation of controls. Is that?
If the chairman would yield back the time, not necessarily in anticipation of the legislation, but there are farmers right now in Ohio's 18th district, for example, that are and have been for several years engaging in no-till practices on their farms. And they've been doing it because it was the responsible thing to do, it was the right thing to do, and not necessarily for any kind of monetary gain. What this bill will do, as it's written now, is reward those farmers who commence engagement in no-till practices, but it won't reward those farmers who have been doing it for several years. So this amendment is designed to give the administrator of the EPA the authority to look back and capture those people that have been doing it, to give them the full credit of the carbon capture offset.
I think it makes a great deal of sense. Mr. Gentleman's time, yield back the balance of your time?
I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Barton?
Mr. Chairman, I know the hour's late and we want to catch planes or go eat supper, or depending on your mood, go have a drink because you're so despondent about this passing or whatever. But my good friend from Ohio has just highlighted one of the real problems in this legislation. We're going to give credit, if this becomes a part of the bill, and since you said you support it, it's going to, for activities that have already occurred that may or may not have been intended to get credits simply because somebody made a decision sometime after January the 1st, 2001 to do something that they thought made sense, but now will qualify for offsets that can become a commodity that can be sold. My great-grandfather had 3 windmills on his farm in Whitney, Texas in 1890. If you use this logic and change that date from January the 1st, 2001 to January the 1st, 1890, he would be eligible if he were alive.
Will the gentleman yield?
I'd be happy to yield.
That is a legitimate, entirely legitimate concern that you have, and I believe that this amendment addresses that concern because it confines the ability to take advantage of this exception to those cases where it's not just simply easily reversible, but in those cases where the administrator finds that there is an incentive for people who are engaged in smart, responsible practices to stop doing so and then re-engage or reinitiate after a period of time so that they can then become eligible. In your case, in your grandfather's case, he's not likely to tear those windmills down and then rebuild them after a period of time to take advantage of the credit. In this case, with the no-till practices, all a farmer would have to do is stop behaving responsibly, after a period of time, re-engage in the practice, and then he's eligible for the credits. And in that interim gap, we're going to be seeing an additional influx of carbon into the atmosphere, and I think it obviates and is counterproductive to the purpose of the bill.
Well, reclaiming my time, if you're going to have a cap-and-trade program, which I don't think we need, but that's beside the point, it makes sense to have an offset component. But we've already, I think we've shown in the debate, and I think we've got instances that when you have offsets, they are extremely subject to abuse and to fraud. And for the life of me, with all due respect, I don't see why we're accepting something that is retroactive. At least make your offset program proactive so that it doesn't kick in until the act actually kicks in. And I mean, I think you're going to be amazed at how many projects all of a sudden seem to qualify because they were commenced in the early 2000s. And then you're going to get pressure to come in and say, well, you know, we did that same thing in 1995. So maybe we ought to retroactively go the date even a little bit farther back. I mean, you're setting a terrible precedent, Mr. Chairman, by, and I'm not discounting the sincerity of the author of the amendment, but this is going to be a nightmare. It's going to be abused there are going to be millions or hundreds of millions of dollars fraudulently claimed under this program, and I just would hope that we wouldn't accept it. But I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. The vote now comes on the space amendment. All those in favor of the amendment say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. No. The ayes have it, and the amendment's agreed to. Mr. Boyer, I want to recognize you at this time.
How many further amendments, Mr. Chairman, do you have?
Do you wish to be recognized or not?
Do you have more amendments?
We have a Matheson amendment, a Gonzalez colloquy. The Matheson amendments can be withdrawn. Mr. Rush wants to be recognized. You can engage in a discussion. And then there is a manager's amendment. And that manager's amendment would require an actual vote. Would you prefer us to go with our manager's amendment?
Yes.
Okay. I'm offering it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Am I offering it? Okay. I have an amendment at the desk. And without objection, that amendment will be considered as read. And I'd like to have 5 minutes to discuss it. The manager's amendment.
Is this the clean version of the manager's amendment?
The manager's amendment makes a number of technical, conforming, and other changes that I don't believe are controversial. In fact, we've shared this amendment with Mr. Barton, and he and his staff have had a chance to review it. And I don't believe that there's any problem that he has with this.
Mr. Chairman, we're prepared to accept the amended manager's amendment, the revised version.
I could discuss it in more detail, but I think I ought to stop while I'm ahead.
Point of order, Mr. Chairman. Has your manager's amendment been at the desk for 2 hours? I hope you'll be honest about it.
We've known about it for over 2 hours. I will say that.
No, but I think the question is, I'm just curious of whether the
the answer to the gentleman's inquiry is yes. Now, the vote comes on the manager's amendment as amended. Well, the manager's amendment as all those in favor of the amendment say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the amendment's agreed to. Mr. Matheson, I recognize you next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
The amendment will be accepted. The amendment will be considered as read, and the gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm offering an amendment in order to help or address issues related to small business refiners. Small refiners are found in 22 states in this country, including those owned by farm cooperatives. There's a high concentration of small business refiners in the interior West. They're essential to fuel supply in that area, and there are very few alternative suppliers, if any. Governors from Wyoming, South Dakota, and New Mexico support assistance for these refiners. Other members of Congress have also written to the committee in support of action. Small refiners are in a different position than large refiners. And this is, by the way, small refiners are defined in federal government. A small business definer is an entity that refines less than 205,000 barrels a day. They're in a different position and have more exposure than large refiners, just because larger companies have international facilities and greater scales of economy. So what this amendment does is it tries to address that issue for small business refiners by providing 1% of allowances from the unallocated pool to help these refiners. It's targeted assistance. It would phase out in 2025. This amendment tries to balance transitional assistance with expectations of transitioning to a low-carbon economy. And, Mr. Chairman, I would now yield to you.
I thank you very much for yielding.
Chairman?
To me. Yes.
If I could, the gentleman would yield.
Well, gentleman, yield to me, and then I'm sure he'd be happy to yield to you next, since he does have time available. I understand what the gentleman is attempting to do, and I'm very sympathetic to that. I want to work with the gentleman and others on the committee who have an interest in this matter and prepare a possible amendment on the House floor to address this concern.
Okay, I appreciate that. Mr. Green, do you want me to yield?
Well, Mr. Chairman, first I would say I'd accept his amendment. but I understand. Our 2% was negotiated, included both large refiners and small refiners. In fact, we have refiners who have small refineries that would fit under what we would consider a small refinery, but put together they would be pretty large. But I appreciate the chairman's support for trying to address this issue and hopefully increase it to a percentage higher on the House floor. And I just want to thank you for your work, and again, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your work with us.
No, I really appreciate it, Mr. Chairman, and look forward to working with this as the bill moves forward.
The gentleman withdraws his amendment.
I'll withdraw. Yes, I'll withdraw the amendment, and I'll yield back.
And yields back the balance of his time. Mr. Martin?
Yeah, I'd like to seek recognition to strike the requisite number of words.
Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I want to thank the gentleman from Utah for his efforts here. I would also like to thank Mr. Green for his efforts. I will point out, if you really want to help refiners, because you're not having a special exemption for some of the tailpipe emissions, the refiner allowance program needs to be 44%. So you're at 2%. Mr. Matheson wants to go to 3%. If you really want to hold harmless the motorists of America, you ought to put 44%. The problem, if you do that, you go over 100% in terms of free allowances, which is a problem even for this new Democrat majority. So, 2%, 3%.
Gentleman, yield to me?
I'd be happy to yield.
I disagree with the gentleman's statement, but I really, at this late date, at this late hour, I really don't want to go into all the debate about it, but I'd be happy to discuss with you further why I don't think your argument would be justified, and your suggestion would be justified. But I'll accept the fact that we might have a disagreement about it, but I think if we had an opportunity to talk it over, you could see our point of view.
I would certainly listen, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Gentleman yields back. Mr. Gonzalez.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'd like this opportunity, and I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to enter into a colloquy with you regarding emission allowances. I know you've been waiting for this with bated CO2 breath. The local distribution companies bringing new plants online in the next few years. I don't think members understand that there may be as many as 10 just on this side of the aisle that would be impacted, but there would be consequences because of the timing of getting the permit, the license, the construction, and when they would come online. The original draft inadvertently left these facilities out of the calculation for allowances, and several local distribution companies would have faced a situation whereby they would have had to purchase significantly more allowances from day one under the rules of this bill, instead of being covered by the LDC allocation presently described in the bill. In the case of San Antonio, the municipally owned LDC would have had to raise rates to cover the additional cost to deliver electricity to meet the basic need that would have diluted the consumer protections that were incorporated into the bill. While I agree with the goals of the legislation, that is to reduce CO2 emission, I do not believe it would be fair if those local utilities, which are adding capacity in the immediate future to meet their baseload needs, would have to begin at a disadvantage. In comparison to other electricity LDCs, the only difference is that their additional facility won't come online by the date of this legislation, despite the financial investment having been made, the permitting process having been completed, and the construction being underway. The amendment, in the nature of a substitute, does include language to address the concerns of these local distribution companies which have facilities coming online after 2009, but not later than 2012. However, it is in need of a correction to properly determine how to calculate those emissions for plants having less than 3 years of operation. The proposed fix in the bill we are about to vote on today is a very strong first step in that direction, but I would hope that I would have the commitment from the chairman that we will continue to work to address the deficiency in the language as it exists.
If the gentleman would permit, I thank you for raising this issue. Our staffs have worked together on it, and I want to assure you that we'll continue to work together as the process moves forward. You've raised an issue of great concern.
Thank you very much, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks Mr. Rush? Mr. Dingell.
Mr. Chairman, I want to compliment you for the way that you've handled this and express my thanks to you for the fair way in which you have considered the concerns of the members and think that we have basically a good bill. I do want to make just one small remark, and I hope my friend Mr. Engel is around here because I want him to hear what I have to say. I have great respect for him, and he's a fine member and a good friend. He wants to use our imported, rather to use flex fuels instead of imported oil. So do I. But so there's language in the statement of managers which I find to be most curious. First of all, it requires, or rather allows, the Secretary of Energy to mandate light-duty vehicles to be flex fuel vehicles. But understand, not all flex fuels, but only E85 and M85. Now, M85 is an interesting fuel because its major component is methyl alcohol, which is made by burning coal. It is also interesting that this wonderful substance, it happens to be a deadly toxic substance which can impair the health of people simply by falling on the skin of the individual concerned. Now, it's particularly interesting because although we've been trying to stimulate the production of alternative fuels and flex fuels, we find that E85 is available in less than 1% of all fuel stations in the country. And we've had hearings in this committee on this matter under my chairmanship to try and see that we did something about this. Now, we find, however, the fuel is not available in quantities enough to meet the current demand, let alone any future demand that might be anticipated. Congress mandated, as you will recall, 36 billion gallons of renewable fuels to be produced by 2022. But even assuming that the RFS of 36 billion gallons can be met, this will still just represent 20% of the total gasoline fuel, and half of 20% will be E10. Where the fuel for these flex vehicles will come from, nobody knows. The fuel infrastructure isn't there to justify these mandates and the cost of industry to industry and consumers. Now, it should be noted that the cost of this is relatively minor. It costs another $100 to $200 a car. Well, we're going to have a lot then of cars for which consumers are going to be paying an extra $100 or $200 and driving around the country hunting for places where they could put in the flex fuels which the car is capable of using. This will, of course, also require significant subsidies from the taxpayers. Having said this, it should be noted that we are not going to have the flex fuels available at any time in the foreseeable future. So this is a total error in that we have gone about creating a lot of cars for which there will be no fuel. It's my hope that somebody around here will realize that this is not a good thing to do, and that we will set about then doing something which will make sense, and that is, instead of stimulating the productions of cars which can't find a useful fuel, that they will then set about creating a useful fuel for which we have right now too many cars to properly fuel the fuels, or rather to fuel the vehicles. Now, again, I respect my colleague, Mr. Engel, and his goal is a desirable one, but his mechanism for achieving it is an erroneous one. And if we intend to do something here about addressing the problem that we confront with regard to global warming and loading the atmosphere with carbon, this portion of the amendment is not the right way to address it. So I will perhaps be filing a minority view on this, and I will be working between now and the time we get on the floor to find a more rational way of addressing this situation. And I will look forward to working with you and hopefully with Mr. Engel to achieve some kind of a sensible or a conclusion to what is a work of great enthusiasm, but rather diminished effectiveness. And I thank you, and I yield back the balance.
Would Mr. Dingell yield?
Certainly, I'll be glad
Thank
to.
You.
Maybe
Thank
you
you.
can explain why I have to be concerned about these things.
Well, I thank you.
You've got a fine amendment, it just doesn't work.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm glad that we have an opportunity to discuss this, and I certainly respect your concerns, and I certainly take them very, very seriously. But I have concerns as well. I am concerned that the United States of America for too long has been addicted to oil, to foreign oil, and I believe with all my heart that the only way that we can wean ourselves off of Middle Eastern and foreign oil is to make this country energy independent. I think that this...
If the gentleman would permit me to make an observation.
Certainly.
He's requiring the manufacture of large numbers of automobiles, or potentially large numbers of automobiles, but there is no fuel available for those vehicles.
Well,
this is a most curious thing. If my good friend wants to address this problem, let's address the fuel and the supply side as opposed to addressing this other matter in this other curious way.
Will the gentleman yield?
What the gentleman has done has been to create a situation where there's going to be all of these flex fuel vehicles driving around looking for a place that they can get flex fuel. He's done nothing to address the supply side.
Well, if the gentleman will yield back to me, perhaps I can...
The gentleman's time has expired. I want to yield 2 minutes to Mr. Engel, and then I want to yield time to Mr. Barton, and then I think we've just got to move on, folks. So, Mr. Engel is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's hard to do this in 2 minutes, but I'll try my best. I visited a country like Brazil, which every car manufactured in Brazil was a flex fuel car. And when you drive into a gasoline station in Brazil, you can get ethanol, methanol, or gasoline. I believe it creates competition, and I believe that's very important. I also believe, to Chairman Dingell's point, is that it becomes a catch-22. If you don't have the vehicles that will use this kind of fuel, then you won't have the fuel. I believe if you build the vehicles, you will then get the fuel. I also believe very strongly that it would cost $90 or $100 at most per car to do this. And I think that's a very small price to pay to make us energy independent. While we are moving to solar and wind and all those other things, we cannot get from step 1 to step 10 overnight, and I think this gives us another vehicle. If we're talking about plug-in electric vehicles, they can be flex fuel as well. So when the President of the United States, and I commend him, announces that for $1,300 more a car, he's going to increase CAFE standards, which I applaud, I think for $90 to $100 a car, we could do this in America and make every car flex fuel. And frankly, I am perplexed why the automobile industry is lobbying so heavily against this. Maybe they ought to get into the real world and understand that the reason why people aren't buying cars is because they're not doing the kinds of things that the American public wants, and they've resisted these changes for years and years. They thankfully have stopped resisting the change towards better CAFE standards with the President, but they're still resisting these changes with lobbyists and everything else here trying to block it. I think that what we want in this country is energy independence, and I think that flex fuel cars are one of the ways to go. And frankly, I would be delighted to work with Chairman Dingell on a way to make this happen, whether it's on the supply side with the fuel or whether it's making more vehicles. But we have to do this, and this language, I think, is a small step in that direction. We need to go even further, and I would hope that we can go further before the time the bill hits the floor of the House for us to vote on it. And I thank Chairman Waxman for being generous with his time.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Barton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be brief. It's good to see Democratic unity on display in the committee. It does show, and I mean this seriously, I don't appreciate the work product, but I do appreciate the work effort that you and Mr. Markey have exhibited in bringing the bill this far. It is truly remarkable to see what y'all have been able to accomplish. But I want to encourage my good friend from Michigan. He can do more than file a minority report. He can vote with me against the bill. And if he can bring Mr. Stupak and a few others, we can start over. And I guarantee my friend from Michigan, we can make him very, very happy. With that, I want to yield to Mr. Shimkus.
Thank you. And I had promised not to speak, but of course the renewable fuels debate compels me. because of what we said before. This is a debate that should have been in a manager's amendment. Elliot Engel is right. In this Congress, under Republican leadership and under Democrat leadership, have pushed renewable fuels. You are part of this now acceptance of renewable fuels as being an option in the liquid fuel debate. You have accepted this baby. Now you have to help nurture it. To cut it off before it entered grade school would be a great disservice. In my district, I can get from, and I represent parts of 30 counties in southern Illinois, I can fill up continuously with E85. I've had E85 vehicles 3 different congressional terms. This is the only thing we've done to reduce our reliance on imported crude oil, renewable fuels. And this cost to the manufacturers is so small that it's crazy not to have choices. It's just crazy. So I'm really taking offense at what the Chairman Emeritus has done, and Elliot, I'm with you, buddy. Let's fight it.
Before we get into a fight, let me move on to another subject, but I want to say to all my colleagues that we have difference of opinion. I don't want to get corny about it, but we all want the same goals, and we have to work together. Get the pun, corny? Anyway,
all right.
Mr. Rush?
You're no Ed Markey, Mr.
You're right. Mr. Rush.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Chairman, when we started this markup, in my opening statement, I said that this was a good bill, and after 3 days, I still believe that it's a great bill. I think the bill would have been even much greater had I been able to overcome some of the jurisdictional barriers with the Ed Labor Committee, because had I been able to successfully overcome those arguments, then I would have offered an amendment that would have covered construction projects funded or assisted by this by the underlying bill, and my amendment would have provided a unique opportunity to target quality green jobs and training programs and opportunities to low-income and underrepresented workers, communities who traditionally have been left out of the opportunities to share in our nation's prosperity. Mr. Chairman, without strong requirements, low road contractors could predominate on projects covered under this act, and they possibly would fail to provide job training, and they would squander a chance to build middle-class construction careers in a new green economy that works for all of us. States and cities have pioneered the use of targeted hiring and apprenticeship requirements on public-funded construction projects all across this country. They've demonstrated some of the best practices for ensuring job quality and equitable access to employment and training opportunities. And Mr. Chairman, my proposal was supported by a broad coalition of advocates for green jobs, for workers' rights, for job training and economic justice, including Green for All, the National Employment Law Project, the Partnership for Working Families, the Center for Community Change, and the Campaign for Community Values, and the Transportation Equity Network, and many, many others. The principles reflected in my proposal resulted from many months of discussions with key stakeholders, including the Building and Construction Trades Department of the AFL-CIO. The proposed language would have targeted jobs to low-income local workers. Contractors would have had to ensure that a percentage of project work hours are worked by either low-income local workers or by women, and the minimum percentages would have ranged from 10% with a goal of at least 30%. It would have also ensured quality job training opportunities where certified apprenticeship programs were located near a project, and contractors would have had to maximize the use of registered apprentices. And this would have generated quality job training opportunities and promoted use of high-road contractors. Lastly, Mr. Chairman, my proposal would have supported quality pre-apprenticeship training programs, and 1% of each project's funds would have been dedicated to pre-apprenticeship training programs that would have a strong record of training low-income workers. And these programs would have helped to provide pathways into long-term middle-class construction careers and ensure a pipeline of workers ready to step into new apprenticeship positions. And Mr. Chairman, this is an issue that won't go away. It's extremely important to me and to my district. And Mr. Chairman, I look forward to working with you to address this matter, these issues, before the bill comes to the House floor. And with that, I yield back the balance.
The gentleman yield just to me to acknowledge that you've made a very powerful point. That we want jobs, and we want to make sure we get them to a lot of the people who need them the most. And while what you wanted to do was so worthwhile, and I think would have had strong bipartisan support, it's not within the jurisdiction of our committee. But I'm going to work with you and our colleagues on the other committees and see if we can make this happen. And I want to commend you for your compassion and your concern and your commitment to the working people and the people who want to be working people in this country. Thank you very much. Ms. Blackburn, gentlelady from Tennessee, I want to recognize you for 5 minutes. Did you have an amendment you want to offer?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And as you are aware, I will offer and withdraw. But this is an issue that has not been addressed in this entire bill. My amendment, which is a Title IV amendment, it would create a Section 447, would create a sense of Congress. It is a sense of Congress regarding intellectual property rights. My amendment seeks to protect U.S. intellectual property in 2 ways. Number 1, by encouraging the administration to not agree to any international climate change accord that contains exceptions to intellectual property rights that will hurt U.S. businesses and workers. And number 2, to limit countries eligible for U.S. foreign aid authorized by the legislation to only those that have demonstrated a commitment to protecting IP rights. Strong IP rights also help to facilitate technology transfer to other countries, a purported goal of the underlying legislation, by providing companies the confidence to engage in foreign direct investment, joint ventures, partnerships, and licensing agreements internationally. If the U.S. agrees to weak IP protection in a rush to adopt international agreements, it will stifle critical R&D investments in the new technology and slow its deployment. The first part of the amendment says that IP must not be neglected or used as a bargaining chip. The second part of the amendment expresses the sense of Congress that U.S. tax dollars not be used by other nations to purchase state-of-the-art U.S. technology, which might subsequently be reproduced by foreign companies or counterfeited and used domestically or exported to other markets, including our own. In either case, the results would be the same: lost jobs for U.S. workers, lost revenue for U.S. companies, and less incentive to invest in future clean technologies. The stats that I have to back this up, and this is why I feel like it is so important that we consider this issue. And, Mr. Chairman, I would ask that we please consider this before the bill goes to the floor. U.S. inventors hold 50% of the world's U.S. patents granted in the clean energy field over the period from 2002 to 2008. The U.S. leads the world with 52% of U.S. patents in fuel cells. We hold nearly half the world's granted U.S. wind patents that have been granted since 2002. That is 48% of those. 46% of the world's U.S. solar patents. The U.S. holds 40% of the world's granted U.S. patents in the hybrid electric vehicle market. And I will mention that the 3 states at the top of the heap on holding these patents are California, Tennessee, and Ohio. We know that our American engineers and innovators are leading the world in creating clean energy ideas. It is imperative that we as members of Congress demonstrate our intent to protect the innovators' intellectual property rights before embarking on any plan to combat international climate change. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to working with you on the issue.
Will the gentlelady yield just for a second?
Yes, I will yield to Mr. Stearns.
I just wanted to ask counsel, she makes some very good points, and she talks in her bill about the United States funding directly other countries in meeting the costs of mitigating greenhouse gas emissions or adapting to the impacts of climate change. How much money is in the bill for assisting other countries in meeting their greenhouse gas emissions?
Section 782 Section 782 provides allowance value for those purposes.
So how do we help? It says that meeting the cost of mitigating greenhouse gas emissions. How do we do that, and how much money is involved? Does anyone on the Democrat side know?
Gentleman, we don't know, but we'll get you an answer.
Well, the council doesn't know either then, huh? I mean, is it less than...
We'll get you an answer.
Is it? Does anybody know ballpark how much we're talking about?
The allowance price will be set by the market, and we'll have to see what the market will bring. But we don't have an answer for you at this time, or even a good estimate, or even an energy... Well, we don't have a good estimate for you. We'll have to get that for you. Gentlelady's time has expired. Mr. Boyer, you have an en bloc amendment. Without objection, the en bloc amendments, if you'll identify, I think you already identified them?
No, I have not.
Okay, would you identify the amendments you wish to offer en bloc?
I reserve a
Chairman,
point of order.
the en bloc request will be 8 amendments.
8 amendments.
It will be, mine is identified as CCA 09-097. It's Boyer 100% CDC allocation. Number 2 is the Burgess 032 regarding international offsets. Then there are the next 5 amendments are from Mr. Upton, identified as MPB2 564. Next is MPB2 565. Next is MPB2 566. Next is MPB2 567. Next is MPB2 568. And the last amendment would be Scalise 001A regarding a 5-year reauthorization of Title III, Mr. Chairman.
The members have heard the identification of the amendments, and the amendments are being distributed, and the gentleman is recognized to speak on his amendments. And he has 5 minutes. He can yield time to others, but it's his 5 minutes on behalf of the en bloc amendment.
I'll first identify Mr. Burgess's amendment regarding international offsets. He seeks to strike the International Offset Authority. Mr. Burgess is seeking that the allowances go to the source of emissions. Regarding the Boyer amendment, I have great concerns about the proposal before us would award individual utility emissions permits based on a percentage of their emissions in retail sales. I believe this results in a windfall revenue for those regions in the United States with 0 or low emissions and is a disproportionate burden to those who are dependent on fossil fuel. Indiana in particular, fossil fuel dependency is 99.6%. So I did a little math. So when I go back and I do the math, the data compiled by EIA sales data and extrapolation of the NERC sub-region data and EPA emissions data. What I have learned is that for a typical Indiana utility, NIPSCO or PSI, they would get, under the present scheme in the bill, 0.55 to 0.57 allowances per ton of emissions. Now, a typical California utility, I'll choose Southern Cal Edison or PG&E, they would get 1.34 to 1.63 allowances per ton of emissions. In other words, they're going to have more than they need to sell back to the Midwest and other parts of the country. For a typical Washington utility, for example, Puget Sound or Seattle City Light, Puget Sound would receive 0.96 allowances per ton of emissions that they are responsible for, and Seattle gets 4.86 allowances per ton that they're responsible for. So, Southern Cal Edison gets 2.43 times the allowances per ton of CO2 emissions than a utility in Indiana, and PG&E gets 2.97 times more than one in Indiana. Seattle City Light gets 8.84 times the allowances per ton of CO2 emissions in Indiana, and Puget Sound gets 1.7 times the amount of munitions. So this allocation formula, I think, would be better if it's based on the carbon content of fuel. That is a much better mechanism to lower the costs to consumers. With that, I would like to yield 1 minute to Mr. Scalise of Louisiana to discuss his amendment.
I'd like to thank the gentleman from Indiana. This amendment just places a 5-year sunset on the bill, just like so many other things we do here in Congress. Earlier today, FAA just got reauthorized. Highway bill has to get reauthorized. If you look at this bill, and of course, if all the predictions on the other side are correct and all the jobs would be created that they say and no job loss would occur, there'd be a line from here to Maryland to reauthorize the bill. But if, on the other hand, a lot of the things that we've suggested and so many outside experts have suggested, and even your own bill suggests, that there could be massive unemployment, jobs going to China and India, as well as more carbon being emitted because they would be done in countries that don't have our regulations, then we should have a stopgap measure in place to give a protection that this has to be reauthorized. The word unemployment is in this bill at least 16 times. There's over 50 pages dedicated to unemployment. Then they get into words like partial separation, adversely affected employment 46 times. That's the same thing as unemployment. We've talked about off-ramps. There's a title they even start using political correctness and say bridge to retirement instead of unemployment. So there's all kind of terms in here, over 50 pages dealing with unemployment. If that happens, this should at least be and have some kind of accountability in place so that the taxpayers, the people that would be unemployed because of this bill, should be able to have some relief.
Thank you, Mr. Scalise. I now yield the remaining time to Mr. Upton.
I want to thank the gentleman for carrying this amendment. My amendments really do protect the consumers. We know the Michigan story. Things are bad, expected to get worse. And if things in the rest of the, if the economic climate in the rest of the country follows Michigan's poor lead, we are in real trouble. And what my series of amendment does is this. And by the way, we heard today from Mr. Radonovich that I guess electric utility increases in the state of California are going up 11%, and that's before this bill gets enacted. But if this bill gets enacted and things continue to get worse for the rest of the country, we provide an off-ramp. We say that the bill is, these provisions will be sunset if utility account terminations reach 8 million households. The second bill, we say that it's sunset if gas arrearages hit an average of $400. It's the average. We say that it will be sunset as well if the average arrearage in an electric bill equals $175. And the fourth bill, if natural gas arrearages accounts equal at least 1 in 4 households around the country. And the last one, we sunset it if percentage of overdue accounts in the electric industry hits 25%. In parts of Michigan, we're 1 in 3. Probably $400 to $500 million in lost money going to my utilities in Michigan because of high accounts. If this legislation increases the personal consumers' accounts in gas and electricity by a magnitude of what we've already seen in Michigan, we say stop. Consumers, you're going to be protected, and we're going to come back and help you by sunsetting this legislation and come back and go through a markup to make this bill a little bit more responsible, and I yield back my time. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Markey is recognized.
I thank the gentleman. There are 8 separate component parts to this en bloc amendment, so I will try to, in this brief period of time, reflect upon a few of them. First, the 5-year sunset, essentially, on the bill. In terms of creating a marketplace for predictable investment in the technologies that are going to be necessary in order to move us to this clean energy jobs future. It will basically discourage a very large percentage of what we believe to be a $1 trillion marketplace ready to go once they know what that marketplace is going to look like. And so just from the very beginning, saying that the whole program sunsets in 5 years ensures that the investment will not be there. Second, in terms of the allocation with regard to the utility sector, we work with the Edison Electric Institute in developing this formula. This is a formula that was accepted across the full span of the Edison Electric Institute. It's something that was embraced by them and actually serves as a foundation to the legislation. Perhaps it could have been tweaked here or there, but you could not, in fact, achieve a consensus in an organization that broad unless those internal deliberations led to a certain regional fairness in terms of the way in which that program was constructed. Thirdly, in terms of international offsets, as we all know, 20% of all greenhouse gases are emitted because of deforestation. The preservation of the rainforests of our planet are without question one of the most cost-effective way in which compliance with this bill can be achieved. To remove international offsets from this legislation would be to, one, make it more expensive for all of the entities covered by the legislation to comply, and secondly, we would not be investing in that area where we could have derived the greatest reductions in greenhouse gases. So the totality of the amendments that are all bundled here in this one proposal reflect, again, a skepticism of the legislation, and that is the right of the minority. But at the same time, we believe that in its totality, that the provisions which we have dealing with consumer rates, working through the Edison Electric Institute, looking at the trade-exposed, energy-intensive industries, looking through the steel industry, the cement industry, the paper, the aluminum, and other trade-exposed industries in terms of the allocation formulas, looking at the natural gas, the oil heating sector, putting together these formulas, all intended to create a pathway that makes it possible for industries to make the transition with consumers to this new clean job creation future that backs out the imported oil while at the same time reducing greenhouse gases. So I hope that the members on our side reject these amendments.
Would the gentleman yield
to the chairman, if he would like, for a comment. But beyond that, I just urge a no vote, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Mr. Barton seeks...
Chairman, I withdraw my reservation.
The reservation for a point of order is withdrawn. Mr. Barton?
2 minutes.
Yield to you 2 minutes, and you may yield
some
to
of
others.
that to Mr. Boyer. But let me say first, on the international offset program, that is a disaster waiting to happen because the UN and the European Union have been trying to find a way to get compliance with their international offsets, and they have admitted that it is almost impossible to do. Again, we're not opposed to an offset program if you're going to have a cap and trade program with allowances, but those offsets ought to be domestic, not international. And there is some, again, implicit acknowledgement of the problems internationally because it requires either 1.25 or 1.5 tons of international offsets to get a 1-ton credit in the United States. On the 100% allocation that Mr. Boyer put in play, that is a huge issue and is something we're going to discuss hopefully at length in the hearing that the chairman has promised to have. You really do create a regional disparity. If you're in a region where all of your electricity is generated by coal or natural gas, you get a 50% allowance. So you're going to have to buy 50%. If, on the other hand, you're in a region where the electricity is generated primarily by hydro or wind power or nuclear power, you get your 50% for your for your emissions, and then you get 50% for your retail sales, if I understand it. That is an absolute windfall. And what that means in the real world is money is going to go from the South and the Midwest to the Northwest and to those areas that have a heavy component of nuclear power. It's an unfair windfall. Now, the fact that EEI supports it doesn't necessarily mean that it's the right thing to do. And I would guarantee you that if this bill becomes law, we will come back every year and tweak that, trying to rebalance that balance. I want to yield negative 13 seconds to Mr. Boyer.
Mr. Chairman, may I ask unanimous consent for 30 seconds?
The gentleman will be given 1 minute, and he doesn't have to take it all.
I thank the chairman. First of all, Mr. Chairman, I want to agree with you. I believe every member here in this committee, we want what's best for our country. And as I look at the map of the country, I recognize, as Mr. Shimkus had brought out, that there are regions of the country that have a higher standard of living, and they are going to have their utility bills drop under the present schematic in the bill. And so the numbers that I shared with the committee, I think, tell the story very well on how I believe that the 50-50 formula is unfair. But that's the dimension which I see the world, because I come from a state that's 96% dependent. But, Mr. Chairman, I want to compliment you. I want to compliment you on the arc of fair dealing and wise tolerance in which you have handled the gavel through a very difficult mark, and I extend my personal compliments to you for having done that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. I appreciate that. The vote now, despite those kind words, I'm not going to vote for your amendment. The vote now comes on the Boyer amendment en bloc. And as much as I like Mr. Boyer, never mind, I shouldn't make, I'm chairman. The vote now comes on Mr. Boyer's amendment en bloc. All those in favor of the amendment say aye. Aye. Opposed say no. No. No.
Mr. Chairman, I ask for a roll call.
Okay, let's go for a roll call.
Mr. Waxman.
No.
Mr. Waxman votes no. Mr. Dingell. Mr. Dingell votes no. Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey votes no. Mr. Boucher. Mr. Boucher, no. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone, no. Mr. Gordon. Mr. Gordon, no. Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush, no. Ms. Eshue. Ms. Eshue, no. Mr. Stupak. Mr. Stupak votes no. Mr. Engel. Mr. Engel, no. Mr. Green. Mr. Green votes no. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette votes no. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps, no. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle, no. Ms. Harmon. Mr. Harmon, Ms. Harmon, no. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky votes no. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez, no. Mr. Inslee. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross votes no. Mr. Weiner. Mr. Weiner. Where are you? Mr. Weiner. Mr. Weiner votes no. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson votes no. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield, no. Mr. Barrow. I'm sorry, Mr. Melanson. Where is he? Vote. Mr. Melanson votes no. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow votes no. Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill, no. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui votes no. Mrs. Christensen. Mrs. Christensen, no. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor, no. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes, no. Mr. Murphy of Connecticut. Mr. Murphy votes no. Mr. Space. Mr. Space, no. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney votes no. Ms. Sutton. Ms. Sutton, no. Mr. Braley. Mr. Braley votes no. Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch, no. Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton votes aye. Mr. Hall. Mr. Hall votes aye. Mr. Upton. Mr. Upton votes aye. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Stearns votes aye. Mr. Deal. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield, aye. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus, aye. Mr. Shattuck. Mr. Shattuck votes aye. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Blunt votes aye. Mr. Boyer. Mr. Boyer, aye. Mr. Radonovich. Mr. Radonovich votes aye. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts, aye. Ms. Bono Mack. Ms. Bono Mack, no. Mr. Walden. Mr. Walden, no. Mr. Terry. Mr. Terry votes aye. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers votes aye. Mrs. Myrick. Mrs. Myrick votes aye. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania. Mr. Murphy votes aye. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess votes aye. Ms. Blackburn. Ms. Blackburn votes aye. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Gingrey, aye. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise votes aye. Mr. Inslee. Is Mr. Inslee? Where? Oh. Mr. Inslee. Mr. Inslee votes no. Okay.
Have all members responded to the call of the roll? Chair sees no other members seeking recognition. The clerk. Okay. Clerk will announce the vote.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, on that amendment, there were 20 ayes and, there were 20 ayes and 38 noes.
20 ayes and 38 noes, and the amendment's not agreed to. Ms. Sutton?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I know it's late, so I'll be very brief. Throughout the course of working on this bill, I know that that the chairman have been engaged with many of us dealing with some of the concerns we have over the provisions related to biomass, and I would just ask that perhaps for a commitment to continue our work to see if we can't address those concerns as the bill moves forward.
I think the
Yes, woody biomass is what I said, Mr. Ball.
Yeah, baby. That's right.
I want to give you my commitment because I think this is an important issue and we have to continue to work on it and see if we can find a good accommodation for those who have such great concerns about it. Thank you.
And I would add my commitment as well. I don't think we've begun to learn as much as we are going to learn about biomass, and we are going to create an environment in which that is possible, and we're going to work with the gentlelady and other members towards that goal.
I thank you.
The question is on
for everyone.
The question is on the Waxman-Markey amendment in the nature of a substitute as amended. This is not final passage, but to adopt the amendment in the nature of a substitute as amended. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it. Before we get to the final vote on this bill, I'd like to recognize myself very briefly. I want to thank all members for their work on this legislation. This has been a process, a difficult one for this week, but it's involved many months of work, in fact, many years of work, and I particularly want to thank Chairman Emeritus John Dingell, Chairman Markey, Mr. Boucher, Mr. Doyle, Mr. Inslee, Mr. Green, Mr. Gonzalez, Mr. Butterfield, Mr. Rush, and Ms. Sutton for all their work as we crafted key provisions of this bill. And I want to also add Mr. Space, because his amendment, I don't know if it was yesterday or today, but it was a very important amendment, and I want to express my appreciation to him. And I want to thank Ranking Member Joe Barton for working with me through this process and the consideration of this legislation. He's been a great gentleman and a guide, and I appreciate that. To all the members, I express my admiration for all of you for the work that you've done and being concerned about these issues, even though we have differences of opinion, willing to debate them. We're taking a decisive and historic action to promote America's energy security, to create millions of clean energy jobs that will drive our economic recovery and long-term growth. When this bill is enacted into law, we'll break our dependence on foreign oil, make our nation the world leader in clean energy jobs and technology, and cut global warming pollution. For those who are interested in Trivial Pursuit, we've now had 4 very long days of debate lasting approximately 37 hours. On Monday, we had statements from 30 members of the committee. We received over 350 potential amendments at the desk, including over 280 from our Republican colleagues. From Tuesday through today, we considered 94 amendments, 38 from Democrats, 56 from Republicans. We passed or accepted many of these amendments, and I believe the amendments have improved the bill, and both those that have been adopted and those that we raised various points for us to think about. As a result of our work, our bill today and the process we're following have gained substantial support from industry, labor, and environmental groups throughout the country. Over 60 major organizations, associations, companies, unions, environmental, and community groups have expressed support for the step we're about to take in reporting this bill from committee. From Duke Energy and EEI to the Environmental Defense Fund and the Natural Resources Defense Council and Sierra Club, from GE and Alcoa and DuPont, the mine workers, the auto workers, the steel workers, from Shell and Conoco to the World Wildlife Fund. There's a growing consensus on the need to act and act responsibly, and I believe that's what we have done. But this is not the end of our work. I've committed to the members and to the ranking member that we'll hold further hearings on the allocation portions of the bill. Other committees will consider the bill, and then we'll move to the floor. But every member of this committee should be proud of our work this week and over the past few years on this important issue. And I thank you all for the diligence in which each member has applied himself or herself to the matter before us. This is an important bill, maybe one of the most important bills that we will consider in this Congress. And I want to yield time to Mr. Barton.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for those kind words you said about me, but don't let it happen again. I have already been twittered that my reelect has fallen 5 points because of what you just said. So, but seriously, I do want to commend you and your members, especially Mr. Markey, your subcommittee chairman, for the way you've conducted the debate. As I said earlier, I don't agree with the work product, but I do agree and am very much impressed with your ability in your first major test as chairman to keep the committee functioning in a collegial way, which is no trivial accomplishment. It really is impressive. I want to thank the staffs on both sides, both at the committee level and the personal level.
Don't encourage them to want raises.
Yeah, they have done an outstanding job. At the appropriate time, I will offer an amendment to the bill. We now have a new source of biomass, and that's all the amendments that we've placed at the desk. A small forest somewhere in Greg Walden's district has been destroyed.
It will not count, however, as a renewable.
So, on the substance of the bill, I know that those of you that are proponents have every right to be proud of it, and to the victors go the spoils. So I am not going to speak at length on what I see as the shortcomings. Suffice it to say that myself and others that will not vote for the bill do have legitimate and serious concerns about the redirection of our energy policy in America, which the foundation and the bedrock of our free market economy, which is the most efficient, the most productive, the largest in the world. 1/3 of the world's GDP is based on the United States economy. And that economy, for over 150 years, has been based on a free market allocation of resources in the energy sector. And this bill does make fundamental changes in that basic philosophy. Now, those of you that support the bill have every right to think that those changes are necessary. And for the sake of our nation, I hope to some degree that you're right. I'm afraid that you're not, but we will see. In any event, Mr. Chairman, I do commend you. I also want to commend the members on my side of the aisle. It's easy on the majority to keep up a good faith attitude, and because you're winning. Now, you mentioned that there were 56 Republican amendments offered. I think 2 or 3 of those were accepted. It is not a lot of fun, as you well know, having been in the minority yourself for 12 years, to work very hard and put just as much effort and just as much focus and get beat time after time after time after time, 36-22, 31-20, whatever it is. Not every amendment on the Republican side that was not accepted was a gotcha amendment. And some of those, in fact, I would say many of them have merit. And at some point in time, I do hope we can work in a bipartisan basis on some of these issues. So anyway, Mr. Chairman, you and Mr. Markey have every right to be proud of what you've accomplished. Those of us on the minority side commend you for your effort, look forward to working with you. And one last thing, I do want to commend, in addition to all the members on the Republican side, special commendation to my subcommittee ranking member, Mr. Upton, who has been an absolute soldier.
Thank you, Mr. Barton. I want to yield to Mr. Upton at this point to make a few comments.
I do have a few comments, and I appreciate the way that the markup was run. We alternated amendments back and forth, and as the chairman said, this is one of the most important bills that many of us will ever mark up in this committee. It was important that we went regular order, and we could debate the amendments with a decent amount of time these last number of days. There was a report that came out today that emissions fell last year, but they fell not because of legislation, but they fell because of a weakened economy, something that all of us bear. We're not happy with the unemployment numbers. We're not happy with the trade numbers. We're not happy with the way that the economy of this country has been heading over the last number of months, and for Michigan, it's been it's been a long bad spell. But we expect that with this legislation, should it become enacted, emissions will continue to fall, but it also could fall because of a worsening economy that this bill may bring about, and that fear on our side is genuine. And that's why we work so hard on amendments to try and offset those economic woes. So I would say to the gentleman, to the chairman on the Democratic side, and all to the staff, thank you for allowing us to be able to have our say these last number of days. By committee rules, you allowed us to offer amendments that went back and forth, and we had good engagement, and I think sets the stage for when this bill does get to the House floor. And I would hope that you as chairman and my good friend, Mr. Markey, and we've had a lot of battles that we've been on the same side on over the last year, over the last number of years at telecommunications and now again at energy. I would just hope that when this bill does wind its way to the floor, that you would urge the Rules Committee to be as accommodating as you've been the last couple of days. That we be able to offer amendments, whether they be bipartisan or partisan, on the House floor, because we know, at least on this side, that there are a good number of improvements that we can see to this bill that will indeed reduce emissions without harming our economy. And whether they be with nuclear, whether they be with renewable, whether they be with issues that we've learned a lot about from the Northwest with woody biomass and all of that, we know that we can improve this piece of legislation. We look forward to engaging in a positive way down the road. And again, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Upton. Mr. Markey,
thank you, Mr.
to close the debate and discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. First, I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the masterful way in which you and your staff conducted this proceeding. I want to thank all of the staffs. There's a litany of saints, too long to enumerate, who worked very hard to produce this product, and they each deserve credit. I want to thank all of the members, the Democrats who have been participating in the construction of this legislation, but also the Republicans who have played a very important role in good spirit and seriousness in this debate in trying to improve it, and we thank you for that. I thank my good friend Joe Barton and Fred Upton for the way in which they led the minority throughout this debate. It is a very difficult process. This is my 33rd year on this committee, and I know what it feels like to be in the minority on big energy issues when they're being debated in this committee. And I very much appreciate the way in which you have comported yourselves and the minority has as well. I am proud of the way in which this committee has conducted itself. It is in the finest traditions of the Energy and Commerce Committee, going back through John Dingell and you, Joe Barton, and continued here by Henry Waxman. And I think that is why this committee is held in such esteem. The vote which we are about to cast, in my opinion, is one that will be remembered decades from now. And I know that each member who has participated in this debate knows that. And I thank everyone for their hard work in making this moment possible. So again, Mr. Chairman, I want to congratulate you on the tremendous way in which you have comported yourself, and I move to report favorably H.R. 2454 as amended to the House floor.
First of all, let me ask unanimous consent to make technical and conforming changes, and without objection, that will be the order. The motion before us is to report H.R. 2454 as amended, favorably as amended. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Waxman.
Aye.
Mr. Waxman votes aye. Mr. Dingell. Mr. Dingell votes aye. Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey, aye. Mr. Boucher. Mr. Boucher, aye. Mr. Pallone? Mr. Pallone, aye. Mr. Gordon? Mr. Gordon votes aye. Mr. Rush? Mr. Rush, aye. Ms. Eshue? Ms. Eshue, aye. Mr. Stupak? Mr. Stupak, aye. Mr. Engel? Mr. Engel, aye. Mr. Green? Mr. Green, aye. Ms. DeGette? Ms. DeGette votes aye. Mrs. Capps? Mrs. Capps, aye. Mr. Doyle? Mr. Doyle, aye. Ms. Harmon? Ms. Harmon, aye. Ms. Schakowsky? Ms. Schakowsky votes aye. Mr. Gonzalez? Mr. Gonzalez votes aye. Mr. Inslee? Mr. Inslee, aye. Ms. Baldwin? Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mr. Ross? Mr. Ross, no. Mr. Weiner? Mr. Weiner, aye. Mr. Matheson? Mr. Matheson, no. Mr. Butterfield? Mr. Butterfield, aye. Mr. Melanson? Mr. Melanson, no. Mr. Barrow? Mr. Barrow, no. Mr. Hill? Mr. Hill, aye. Ms. Matsui? Ms. Matsui, aye. Mrs. Christensen? Mrs. Christensen, aye. Ms. Castor? Ms. Castor, aye. Mr. Sarbanes? Mr. Sarbanes, aye. Mr. Murphy of Connecticut? Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Space? Mr. Space, aye. Mr. McNerney? Mr. McNerney, aye. Ms. Sutton? Ms. Sutton, aye. Mr. Braley? Mr. Braley votes aye. Mr. Welch? Mr. Welch, aye. Mr. Barton? Mr. Barton votes no. Mr. Hall? Mr. Hall, no. Mr. Upton? Mr. Upton, no. Mr. Stearns? Mr. Stearns votes no. Mr. Deal? Mr. Whitfield? Mr. Whitfield, no. Mr. Shimkus? Mr. Shimkus, no. Mr. Shattuck? Mr. Shattuck, no. Mr. Blunt? Mr. Blunt votes no. Mr. Boyer? Mr. Boyer, no. Mr. Radonovich? Mr. Radonovich votes no. Mr. Pitts? Mr. Pitts, no. Ms. Bono Mack? Ms. Bono Mack, aye. Mr. Walden? Mr. Walden votes no. Mr. Terry? Mr. Terry, no. Mr. Rogers? Mr. Rogers, no. Mrs. Myrick? Mrs. Myrick votes no. Mr. Sullivan? Mr. Sullivan, no. Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania? Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess votes no. Ms. Blackburn? Ms. Blackburn, no. Mr. Gingrey? Mr. Gingrey, no. Mr. Scalise? Mr. Scalise votes no.
Have all members responded to the call of the roll? Seeing no other member asking for recognition, the clerk will tally the vote. 33-25. Clerk will report the vote.
Mr. Chairman, on the vote on final passage, there were 33 ayes and 25 noes.
33 ayes, 25 noes. The motion is agreed to. Thank you very much.